Okay, presentation on medieval Scotland. Let me check one thing here before we, just in case someone does. Okay, there you go. To an audience of thousands.
All right. My name's Caleb Salmon. This presentation is on early medieval Scotland.
All right.
The earliest recordings, anything written down about Scotland, is by the Roman historian Tacitus. He states the governor Julius Frontinus conquered the people on the line between England and Scotland in 78 AD, but makes no mention of moving past that line, which is where Hadrian's Wall was later built in that region. The next governor, Agricola, goes farther north in 81 AD, and there are Roman forts that date to before his governorship, but there's no records of who built those forts. Presumably it was Frontinus. He establishes the Highland Line as the farthest point of control, which was around here as the farthest point of Roman control north at any time. But he is recalled. Hello? Find a seat. It's a packed house, so. But he's recalled in 84 AD after making his way around the tips of Scotland and sticking to the coast, but he doesn't really make any headway in conquering the Highlands. And after he is recalled, the later successors who aren't named quickly let go of the region and fall back to around where Hadrian's Wall would later be built. Cassius Dio is the next historian to start talking about this time period, and he starts talking about 40 years later in 122, when Hadrian's Wall is starting to being built. And as they do that, they also move up, and in 142 they start building Antonine's Wall right here. But they only stay there at Antonine's Wall for about 20 years before falling back to Hadrian's Wall, which really becomes the border of the furthest full control of Roman authority. In 209, an emperor named Septimus Severus tries to conquer Scotland with a massive army. He cited that they had insulted him as the reason he was going to war. And he brought with him 3 legions, 9,000 special guard, and large contingents of cavalry. And the Scottish fought in a guerrilla war, and he retreats after losing about 50,000 men and getting sick. And he dies in York, planning to go back, but succumbs to the whatever sickness he had. His son thought about continuing the war, decided not to, and just the empire stopped at Hadrian's Wall. After the fall of Rome, we see the Scottish people kind of divide into a few separate groups. Really, 4 main groups who are living in this region at the time. In the west, we have the Gaelic Scots, who are mostly from Ireland. In the northeast are the Picts, which is Latin for painted people or tattooed people. And they're native to that region. In the southeast, are the Celtic Britons, kind of all in this region. also native to the region, and in the south are the Angles, or English, who are the Anglo-Saxon invaders who have conquered all of England at this point in time. So the Scots, also known as the Gaels, both names come from their Irish roots, which you can kind of see right here. That's what the Romans called people from Ireland who raided Western Britain, but they never actually got around to conquering Ireland. Whether they went there at all is a matter of some controversy between historians and archaeologists. The kingdom that is established here is called Dal Raita, something like that. And at its height, it covered most of western Scotland and parts of Northern Ireland. Founded by the mythical Fergus More, who may or may not have existed. He's kind of like a Romulus and Remus type figure. But the first king of Dalriada that we have solid evidence claimed to be Fergus's grandson, Gabrain mac Domangairt. The kingdom of Dalriada had a golden age under Aidan mac Gabrain, who ruled from 574 to 608 when he died, and this was the extent of the kingdom under his control. After the death of Aidan, the Celtic Britons, later Vikings, and the Angles kind of took over. Not directly, but it was puppet kings, and they were vassals of these other kingdoms until sometime between 729 and 761. The Picts from up here take over and unify the two kingdoms into the kingdom of Alba, which is the main predecessor of Scotland. The Picts were divided into several smaller kingdoms that vied for power, with one king would be in charge of the other 6 or so kings at any given time. He'd get killed by one of the other ones, and then that one would be in charge for a bit. The most successful of these kingdoms was Fortrio, which was also the one that was in charge most of the time. An interesting note about the Picts during this time is they traced lineage through the maternal line. And in their early history, basically before they became Christians, it was more important if your mom's side of the family was related to nobility than if your dad's side of the family was related to nobility. If your grandma had been queen on your mother's side, that gave you a better chance at being king than even if your uncle on your father's side had been king. In 900 AD, Fortrio conquered or absorbed the other Pictish kingdoms. It's kind of unclear as to what exactly happened, if it was trading, marriages, or warfare, as well as Dalriada to form the Kingdom of Scotland, which is the Gaelic, or the Kingdom of Alba, which is the Gaelic in Latin Scotia and in English Scotland. They have these things called crannogs, which are little. You can't see in this picture, but they're 30 to 100 feet across in a big circle, and they're little artificial islands that they just built in the middle of lakes, and that was a common dwelling. That it's kind of all over the Gaelic world, and the Picts are one of the people they think it might have started with, just because they don't know quite who originated the idea. But some of them were up in the islands, and the Hebrides and everything were made of stone, and they're just fake islands out in the middle of these lakes that people lived on. The Brythonians, or the Britons, eventually became called the Kingdom of Strathclyde, which joined Scotland in 1093. Called the Old North is what its Welsh name translates to, before Strathclyde becomes an actual kingdom. One early king is named Ceretic Guletic, who received a letter from St. Patrick in the 5th century, setting the date for the kingdom's formation as sometime before that. That's the earliest written thing and written down name of a king from a contemporary source that we have. The other is his descendant, Ritter Kale, who was alive at the same time as Aidan of Dalriada, so sometime from 550 to 610. They were called the Britons of Alt Clut, based off of their main castle from around 600 to 780, and then the castle was burned down, so people stopped calling them that. Their king is captured by the Vikings and killed around 872. So we know they fell to the Vikings, like most of the western kingdoms did during this time on the coast of Britain. And they fought against the Vikings and the kingdom of Alba, and it fell to the Scottish Pictish kingdom of Alba between 1018 and 1054, and it was just absorbed into the kingdom of Scotland at that time, like Dalriada had been before it. So the Vikings are starting their raids and invasions from around 700 to 1200 AD. They encircle the kingdom of Alba, which before the Vikings came was most of this, because it had absorbed Dalriada at this point, and it was slowly moving down here to where this is where Strathclyde is. But the Vikings come in and they take all this northern territory, all of the islands. They're also in Ireland at the time, and all of Northumbria, which was the most powerful kingdom in England, also fell to the Vikings during this time. But this is one of the things that motivates the Picts and the Gaels to get along, because the Gaels are totally pushed out of their territory, and they got the choice of either, okay, we can become Vikings, or we can unify with these guys and actually form a national identity together. And so as the Gaels slowly get pushed out of their territory or absorbed by the Vikings, some of them come here, and this is when the Picts actually take on the name of Scots and Scotland and all of that. This is what pushes Constantine II to change everything over from the Pictish kingdom to the Kingdom of Scotland. His father died in battle with the Vikings in 900 AD, and he got the title King of Scotland, and he was the first king to ever have that title. Before that, it was King of the Picts, King of Fortrio, King of Dalriada, stuff like that. But for the first time, we have the King of Scotland being recorded. This was the beginning of the unified Kingdom of Scotland, as the Vikings were slowly pushed out, which would last until 1707 with the Acts of the Union with England, and then we get the United Kingdoms. Early Scottish government, the king was in charge, but he was mostly a military leader rather than a bureaucrat. His successor was chosen by the heads of the clans from several candidates that were related to the royal line in some way. As I said before, early on in their history, if you're related on your mother's side, it's a lot better for your candidacy to be king. As time goes on, it's better to be related on the male side of your family. Interesting to note, they don't often pick the king's son to be the next king. They go for brothers more often than anything, because they say, hey, we want someone who's older and experienced and was there with the king throughout his life to just keep things running smoothly, rather than someone who's new and young and doesn't have any experience. So if your dad was king, odds are your uncle would be king next, and then you would have to compete with your cousins to be king after your uncle died. The different kingdoms all had different traditions for their kings, and they all kind of morphed into what the King of Scotland was expected to do to appeal to all the different parts. The King of Dalriada, there was a mountaintop that had a big carved footprint in it, and the king had to go up to this mountaintop and stand in the footprints, because it was the legend was that it was the footprint of Fergus More, the first king. And so you had to literally fill the shoes and follow in the footsteps of all the previous kings, because every king had to go up to that thing. And then the Picts and later the Kingdom of Alba had the Stone of Scone. This is a replica of it. The current Stone of Scone is in not in Westminster Abbey, but it's there when they crown British monarchs today, they have to sit on the actual Stone of Scone. Last time that happened was 1953. And so when it's not being used for a coronation, it's in Scotland. And then every Scottish king up until the 11th century was buried on the island of Iona, which had a monastery on it, which is where all the missionaries who eventually converted the Scottish to Christianity came from the island of Iona. One of the earliest manuscripts of the Bible was written there. It's a big Christian religious site for the Scottish. Religion in Scotland, before Christianity came, the Scottish practiced similar paganism to most of Western Europe, same as the Gauls and the British and the Irish. Druids were big. Human sacrifice was probably what was happening, but the only written records of it were by the people who killed all the Druids, so we don't know for sure. And a big emphasis was placed on the outdoors. Christianity was first officially introduced by missionaries from Ireland and southern Britain. Bede the Venerable writes...
Yes, the Venerable Bede.
The Venerable Bede writes about a missionary named Saint Ninian, who is the first person to bring faith to the Picts, but he writes in it that I'm just writing down the traditions that have been passed on to me, and there's no other written documents that Saint Ninian ever existed. So it's unsure. There's no official source on his life. He doesn't have any writings, and there's
He was so venerable he wouldn't lie.
Probably not. I think we can trust him. And then there's also the letter from St. Patrick, which proves that the southern Scots were Christian by at least the 500s, because he's writing to this king, and the king is already a Christian. He's not trying to convert him in the letter. He's writing to him as a Christian. And so the king and the ruling class, at least in southern Scotland, were already Christians by this time. As time goes on, a few splits between Scottish Christianity and mainstream Roman doctrine appear. First, they didn't care as much about celibacy for the priests. Just wasn't a concern for them. They thought that abbots were more important than bishops in the ecclesiarchy hierarchy. And the main point of contention between them and Rome was that they had a different method of determining the date that Easter happened. And this almost caused, major conflict between the two parties. Under Viking rule, much of Scotland backslides and becomes pagan again, following the Viking mythology this time. But once the Vikings are kicked out, reconverted to Christianity very easily. And then this is the monastery at Iona. The island of Iona was important to the development of Christianity in Scotland. On the island lived a monastic order started by St. Columba in 563. And it's this place that every missionary to Scotland was sent from. It was raided by the Vikings from 795 until it was abandoned in 825, when the last monks who stayed there were killed. In 805, after 10 years of raiding, many of the monks left and went back to Ireland, and they took with them manuscripts and a bunch of relics and artifacts. The monastic order was reestablished in 1203, but even when there was no one there, keeping the monastery, it remained an important part of history to the Scottish, and it was important to Scottish tradition. Even when the monks weren't living there, every Scottish king was still buried on this island. And as time went on, the English, a few French kings, and Norman kings were buried there as well, allegedly. Some historians think that didn't happen, and that later kings of Normandy and England and France and all of that just wanted to say they were buried at Iona because it was a very prestigious place in Christendom.
And that is early medieval Scotland.
Wow. Thank you. Thunderous applause.
Very good. All right, let's hear about what the Vikings do for the Byzantines.
Yes, the Varangian Guard. Who actually benefited the most out of
Who did?
Who got the short end of the stick
Who did?
and who didn't? So, what was the Varangian Guard?
Yeah, what were they?
First instances of them being used in the Byzantine Empire around 874. There's a treaty between the Byzantines and the Rus people under Basil I, who I believe usurped power from the previous emperor. Initially it was mandatory. There was a military alliance between the Rus and the Byzantines, and so the Byzantines said, I don't know if it was everyone that fought in the military for the Rus or was certain individuals, but they were required to be part of this kind of military force for the Byzantines. Initially, they would fight battles. It wasn't just being a bodyguard. They would also fight neighboring groups during that time. But in 988, Basil II, not 880, but actually 980, I was confused with that at first, but some time passed, about 100 years, he made it official, and we have now the Varangian Guard that becomes the personal bodyguard to the Byzantine Emperor. And eventually the Rus could choose to be part. They'd pay a certain amount of money, or a certain amount of weight in gold, I should say, and they would eventually get repaid through their service. So, the Byzantines, what did they get out of it? It was more so beneficial to the emperor than the Byzantine people themselves. He had personal bodyguards around him, whether it was at some kind of party, whether it was in the palace, wherever he was. He always had someone around him to make sure that he wasn't getting attacked. He also had this established a military alliance now. Through his treaty in 874, you have a connection with another group. They also wed. I believe it was one of the daughters of the Rus king that established this alliance. The Byzantine emperor also gained protection from neighboring groups that they would fight with. And strangely enough, they trusted these outside groups more than they trusted their own people, because of the potential for usurpers to take over power and try to gain control, whereas the Varangians were like, well, we're not really going to take over power here because we're getting what we want. So what did they want? Well, they got better treatment there than they got in their own kingdom. They weren't really given much opportunity for wealth, for land. That kind of harkens back to the Vikings early on, where they set out for the same things. So it seems as if it's the same goals in mind, but in a different way. Instead of going and raiding different places, now they're getting enlisted by another empire to fight or be a personal bodyguard to the emperor. Also, when the emperor would die, they would make it a Norse right, to pillage the treasury and get even more money out of all this. So you're not only getting paid for what you're doing, but you're also, you also have the chance to take money.
Christmas bonus.
Yeah,
Right.
it's a
So if
commission.
you do a bad job as the bodyguard, and the emperor dies, you get a bunch of extra money.
Yeah, pretty much. I don't know if it'll be the person.
I'm surprised they didn't just deliberately let the emperor die multiple times.
I mean, they may have done that. There may have been some conspiracy, but I mean, maybe long-term goal.
Maybe they had to prove that he died
Yeah.
of natural causes.
If the guy died of old age, then it would make a lot of sense. If the guy died because you didn't do your job, you probably shouldn't get money for that. But Then again, the whole point is for them to get paid for this. So whatever they want.
Let's think of the Vikings.
So my conclusion, my verdict. Initially, it seemed as if it was more beneficial to the emperor because it wasn't voluntary, because they were forced into this and they weren't getting paid to do so. But as it became voluntary, and as time goes on, now there's an incentive to do this. It seems as the Varangians end up having more benefits from being guards. They have a lot more opportunity for wealth and power, even if they're not at this level of being an emperor. But, hey, if the emperor dies, regardless if he dies at your hand or someone else's, you still benefit from it. Yes. And that's reference.
All right. Any questions there about the guard? I think we'll stick with the medieval stuff, and we'll come back to you. We'll keep a theme going as long as we can. That's right. Here we have a lovely presentation about the Vikings' last shot. I think you might just want to use these arrow keys. I don't know, that's not going to work. Hold on. I think you'll have to slide it like this. Yeah. Yeah.
So just use the sidebar?
Yeah. All right. There you go. Yeah, use the slide bar. Okay. There we go.
So, entitled my presentation, The Vikings' Last Shot, because off the rap, actually, in one of John Green's videos, the last battle at Stamford Bridge had actually intrigued me to write my paper about that. So, the beginning, the Vikings were already in England at the time because Canute the Great, which was a Danish king, he ruled from 1016 to 1035 AD. And as you can see, he's right there, which, they look pretty, majority of them look pretty similar. But he had secured power in both Scandinavia and England. Canute then gave the power to Edward the Confessor, and Edward had died in 1066 without a child. So this would cause an issue about the throne, and the reason why the Vikings already wanted a chance at the throne was because they had ties to it because of some marriages when they were invading. They had I remember in the video for them not to be killed, it was like, hey, marry my daughter, here you go, basically spare us. What I wanted to focus on is, as I stated, the battle at Stamford Bridge. But before the war, Canute the Great had left his throne for Edward the Confessor, but obviously Edward had died. Canute's son, Harthonnet, reigned from 1016 to 1035, and supposedly he had told King Magnus of Norway that he was next in line once he passed away. This right here had reminded me from a scene of Game of Thrones of when Robert Baratheon was talking to Ned on his deathbed. But, shows and reality are two different things. King Magnus did not want to fight Edward for the throne, but Hardrada was upset and began planning an invasion for the throne. So, since he was upset, he began, obviously, his invasion, and in September of 1066, I put Harold, but it should say Hardrada. His plan was to take over York, and he sailed along the Ouse River. Hardrada's ally was Toste Goodwinson because he was exiled by his own brother, Harold. It seems likely that King Harold, waiting in the south, received news of the strong Norse force and began to march north to meet them. So he had heard about the invasion, and so he was like, you know what? I'm gonna go meet him at where he wants to try and arrive. Hardrada had arrived to his destination and marched on to York. Hardrada had an army of 7,000 men, and I believe it was like 300, roughly 400 ships with him. So at the Battle of Fulford, the land was flat, but it was really, really wet. So it was like muddy and stuff. And Hardrada had advanced with his men and met King Harold's men. At first, the Harold's army had pushed the Vikings back, but he left a majority of his men along the river. So he had purposely let the English push them back, or the Anglo-Saxons. And once they pushed him back like far enough, then he had his men slip out from, I forgot whether it was the right or the left, but they slipped out around the Anglo-Saxons and actually surrounded them. So the English had fought well, but it was not quite enough because them being surrounded and obviously the number of men that were fighting them. Accounts say that there was enough bodies that you could walk and not get your feet wet anymore. So that means a lot of dead men.
Walking on the corpses.
Yeah. Hardrada and his men occupied York for the time being. Here's a little map layout. Yeah, I found Hardrada's men is in the red and Harold in blue. And once pushed back far enough, those men slip back. And once you're surrounded, can't really do much. On to Stamford Bridge. You may see that. I'm not gonna touch that. You may see that I put some gibberish right there just because I didn't want to spoil the ending. But on to Stamford Bridge. Hardrada could have raided several towns that were nearby from the people that he had fought at Fulford, but he wanted to keep his focus on Stamford Bridge. And so, to be specific, it was in Yorkshire. The Vikings were fighting basically for all the marbles here. This was your last shot at the throne. This was to reclaim it. And so the battle took place on September 25th, 1066. Harold's men, when they had heard about the defeat, he basically told his men that they were going to put all the effort to get to York or to Stamford Bridge, which is where they had decided to meet, and they had arrived there in 4 days. And so the Vikings were caught off guard because of how fast the English had traveled, and so that Harold wasn't going to wait for them to be prepared, obviously, because they were great warriors, and so he had attacked them off guard. The Vikings didn't even wear their gear, so they had I think from what I had read, they had their helmets and their swords out near the river, and then when they were caught off guard, some of them had to obviously run back a little bit to go get their gear, but a majority of them had died because they were caught off guard. Gearless. So Edward's men attempted to cross the bridge, but the Vikings were putting all the power to not let them cross, and they had formed a narrow triangle, but Harold's men went straight forward trying to create a hand-to-hand combat. The battle had lasted an entire day, and it was pretty even until basically the head of the snake was cut off. Hardrada had suffered, he was struck by an arrow right to the chest, and so after that, it's like you lose your motivation once you have that one person that can that wanted the throne. It's like, oh, he wanted the throne. I was just fighting for his purpose, and so his ally Tostig, which is the brother of Harold, he wanted to continue the battle, but Hardrada had told him, hey man, just try and cut a little peace treaty, try and basically surrender. But obviously, probably off of trying to prove to his brother that he could actually have the throne, he just kept going. And eventually the Vikings knew they were going to lose, and so they had retreated with only 24 ships, making it back to Norway. So 24 obviously made it back, and you had about 300, 400 ships with you. Obviously, it's a pretty big loss. And this was basically the fall of the Vikings, because they never again had a lineage tied to them that would put them on the map or put them back on the throne. And so that was as I said, their last shot there. So King Harold had defeated them, and just obviously we sort of know his ending. He had defeated the Vikings, and they were no longer a threat to England. Harold was now the ruler of England, but due to the Battle of Stamford, it left his army not small, but with a pretty good dent. The Vikings were fierce warriors and had lost ships, including 6,000 men. I believe they obviously 7,000 out of 6,000, or 6,000 men that had died, and then you had an army of 7,000. King Harold had lost 5,000 men out of his 15 that went to battle. It may have seemed too much of a problem until Duke. It may have not seemed as too much of a problem until Duke William of Normandy attempted to take his chance at the throne. And then the Battle of Hastings, to basically sum up his ending. William the Conqueror wanted a chance at the throne. Harold was crowned king on January 6th. The Battle of Hastings took place in October 6th against William. It was quite an even matchup until a group of Saxons decided to try and chase down some of William's men, and so it left an area vulnerable. And so William had saw that, and basically William and his men applied pressure there. And once they put enough pressure, obviously, Harold couldn't keep up with that. And I believe Harold did end up dying. He suffered a shot with an arrow to the eye. So that must have been a pretty painful death.
Probably left a mark.
Yeah. And then William was then crowned King of England on December 25th. And those are my references.
Very good. 1066. Pivotal year. Summer of 2017, I did a lot of different things. I dug in Israel, but I also gave a paper in England, in Oxford. And then I decided to do some study of my own. I've been studying Hadrian's Wall on and off for several years. So our first paper was about the Scots and the Picts and so forth. So Hadrian's Wall, pictured here, and I'll be digging along this wall, near this wall, at a site called Vindolanda this summer for 2 weeks. So I should get to know the wall even better then. But this is in England. Yeah, this is in England. So this is the wall itself, part of the wall. This area would then be Scotland, ancient Scotland anyway. Currently the official border with Scotland is probably about 10 miles from here.
Depends on where you are.
Depends on where it is.
On the west end, it's like 5 miles, and on the east end, it's like 70 miles.
Yeah.
Because the wall goes like that.
Yeah, it angles. And then along the wall, you'll see they have these guard towers. Every mile there's a tower. Anyway, here, this will show you where it is. Hadrian's Wall, this is much like the map you just showed. Cuts all the way across. The Romans built this wall, finished it in AD 122, to basically set a border between Roman-controlled Britain and the areas to the north, which they didn't control as well. But I decided that I would go up and take a look at the Antonine Wall. Okay, the Antonine Wall, which is much less studied and not as well known. It was completed or finished or begun in 142, and it's used for probably about 20 years. Completed in 158. 16 forts, several fortlets, and a military highway along here. So here is the route and the different forts along the wall. Here is a picture of Antonius Pius, the guy who had it built. This is the stone that was used to dedicate the wall. Okay. So what I did basically is I had a car that I'd rented, and I tried to trace the entire wall. I stopped at several of the points to see the wall. This was one interesting place. This is the highest point along the wall. You had to go up a little road, 2-lane road, then had to park the car. Then I had to hike up there, and you could see down and see the valley here. Some of the places that you see, there's not a lot left of it. There are markers. It actually became a World Historic Site.
Am I presenting today?
Yes, you are. And here is part of the wall. The base of the wall actually goes through a cemetery. So they also built forts along the way. Very interesting. This is a reconstruction of it on a map, you can see. But they bring some of the things of Rome with them, like a bathhouse, the toilets, and so forth. I thought this was interesting, sort of Roman barbed wire. They near the wall, on the other side of the wall, they built these pits, and they would put spikes up here, wooden spikes, so that as you would approach, you would, of course, have to deal with the pits and the wooden spikes that, of course, could impale
I
you.
think that's more meant for horses. The infantry would see that.
Sure, they would see it, but it's a barrier. It's going to slow you down. So here is, they would build a ditch. So the wall had a ditch in front of it. That magnifies the elevation of the wall. So here it is in Scotland, walking along there. Here is the pit along the wall. So it was an interesting thing to do. All right. Here's our discussion of the First Crusade.
Alright, so I'm doing, I mean, I know none of y'all were listening just now, but I am doing my presentation on the First Crusade, which took place in the late 1000s. Now, if you've learned anything about the Crusades in like public school, you probably get the impression that it was an unprovoked act of aggression against the peaceful Muslim world. That is not true at all. It immediately began because the Seljuk Turks began expanding into the Middle East from Central Asia in the mid-1000s, when they ironically began to conquer Muslim lands. But after they started conquering Muslim lands, they converted to Sunni Islam, and after that, they began going to war with the Eastern Roman Empire and began conquering Anatolia, and created a huge, great empire for themselves. But in 1092, the great Sultan Malik Shah died, and his empire fractured into multiple smaller sultanates that all started fighting each other. And so in 1095, the Eastern Roman Emperor Alexius Comnenus sent a letter to Pope Urban II in Europe asking for military aid from the Christian kingdoms, which really was not uncommon at that time. But Pope Urban saw an opportunity to heal the rift between the Catholic and Orthodox churches and create more stability in Europe and reclaim a lot of Christian holy sites that had been taken by the Muslims hundreds of years before. So he created something that was unlike anything that was seen before. This is essentially what the Muslim world looked like at that time. The Seljuks ruled up here in Anatolia. The official caliphate that the Turks supposedly answered to was mostly in the Middle East. But then in Egypt, a Shiite dynasty called the Fatimids split up and created their own caliphate. So really, it was ironically a very good time to go to war with the Muslim world because they were severely fractured and divided by infighting. So on November 27th, 1095, Pope Urban held a massive council outside the city of Clermont and in France, where he called for holy war against the Abbasid Caliphate and the Seljuk sultanates, and he promised indulgences for any warriors who took part in the holy war. And thus, the warriors who answered the call adopted the designation of crusaders and identified themselves with the Red Cross for travel between kingdoms. But initially, this did not have quite the effect that the Pope was looking for, because a French priest named Peter the Hermit rallied about 4,000 peasants in the city of Cologne for their own crusade. And this went very badly for everybody involved because they started massacring thousands of Jews in the Rhineland despite resistance from the local parishes. And they started traveling to Constantinople so they could invade Anatolia, but they ran out of food in Hungary. Yes. And they started pillaging the countryside of Hungary to get food. They were hungry in Hungary. But once they had reached Constantinople, the emperor was thinking, yeah, these guys are crazy. I'm just going to send them over to Anatolia. So he did. And once they crossed over Anatolia into the Sultanate of Rome, they were absolutely massacred by the Turks because they weren't really an army. They were just a massive mob of peasants with weapons. So the Crusader army proper was actually a coalition of multiple armies led by multiple different lords. They mostly came from France and Flanders and the county of Sicily. From France, the most important guys were Raymond of Toulouse and Godfrey of Bouillon, Baldwin of Boulogne, and Hugh of Vermandois. And from Sicily, the main leaders were Bohemond of Taranto and Tancred of Hatteville, who was Bohemond's nephew. But the interesting thing about the Crusaders from Sicily is that they were actually Normans who had settled in southern Italy, but they weren't actually from Normandy. I just thought that was pretty interesting. And the head honcho of the entire coalition was Bishop Adhemar of Lipoi, who the Pope had directly designated to be the spiritual leader of the entire crusade. So the exact numbers of the Crusader army is not known, but one of my books I read estimated it might have been around 75,000, which was definitely one of the largest armies that has ever been assembled in medieval Europe, and probably the largest army that had ever been assembled there since the days of the old Roman Emperor. And this didn't really play into Emperor Alexius' plans because he was probably expecting a much smaller force of just mercenaries to fight under Eastern Roman command, but instead this army was much bigger than his army. And so he was nervous working with these guys, especially since some of them, like Bohemond, had been fighting the Eastern Roman Empire before. But he thought he got what he wanted, so he sent them across the Bosphorus straight into Anatolia to reconquer his empire. And so the first city to fall was Nicaea, where the Council of Nicaea was held. And so because the peasant crusaders had been wiped out so tremendously by the Turks, they didn't really take this army seriously. And so the Turks were very slow to react when the actual Crusader army came knocking on their doorstep. And it took them several months. It took the Sultan of Rome, I think that's how you pronounce it, several months to actually gather his forces to fight back against the Crusaders. And by that time, the Crusaders had advanced very far in Anatolia. They finally the Turks finally challenged them in a pitched battle on July 1st, 1097, near a ruined Roman town called Dorylaeum. Now, the Crusaders had split up into two forces. One was 2,000 vanguard cavalry knights led by Bohemond, while the other 60,000 trailed behind. Now, Bohemond's scouts realized that the Turks were coming in force, and so they set up a camp near an intersection where sort of a river intersection of sorts, and waited for the Turks to come. So on the morning of July 1st, Turkish cavalry came swarming all over their camp, and the Crusaders formed a massive shield wall all around their camp to hold off the attacks. And for 7 hours, the Turks kept riding around their shield wall, shooting arrows into their camp. And for 7 hours, the Crusaders gradually pulled their shield wall back and back and back. And while this was going on, women started running to the river and bringing back buckets of water for them to drink, because it's Anatolia and it was arid, and if they were not careful, they would easily die from dehydration in just 7 hours. But fortunately, since Bohemond knew the Turks were coming, he sent messengers back to the main force telling them to hurry up and get over there. So as soon as the other knights began arriving across the river, they immediately started duking it out with the Turkish cavalry. And once it took several hours for them to arrive in force, but once all of the Crusader knights were deployed on the right side of the river, they all formed up and charged the Turks from their flanks and the front, and absolutely broke their formation. And while that was going on, a smaller infantry force led by Adhemar sneaked behind them and burned their camp. So they totally routed the Turkish forces from the field and smashed their army, which allowed them to march further in Anatolia almost unopposed. And while this was going on, the Eastern Roman army began securing the territory that the Crusaders had just captured for them. And once they had pretty much gotten to the edge of Anatolia, they were now looking across into Syria. And there were two main routes in Syria, the Taurus Mountains in the south, and the ironically named Anti-Taurus Mountains in the north. The Taurus Mountains were shorter but more dangerous, whereas the Anti-Taurus Mountains were longer but less dangerous. So most of the Crusaders decided to travel through the Anti-Taurus Mountains even though it was longer, they weren't willing to risk losing too many resources in the Taurus Mountains, because they were going to lose men and horses either way, because getting a land army across the massive mountain range is always extremely dangerous. However, they sent a smaller expeditionary force under the command of Tancred and Baldwin through the Taurus Mountains near the Mediterranean. And while they were there, Tancred's knights captured multiple small towns, but then Baldwin captured an Armenian Christian city called Edessa and decided to settle there as the count, and he created the first Crusader state, and he just abandoned the crusade. He just decided to sit in Edessa as their ruler and be comfortable there. He wasn't going to assist the other Crusaders in their bid to retake the rest of the Holy Land. So, but by the time Tancred's force rejoined the main Crusader army in the early fall, they had suffered heavy losses from their trip across the mountains, and thus were running very low on food and water and horses. And they finally reached Antioch, one of the most ancient Christian cities, and about October 20th, 1097. And by this point, the Crusaders were now reduced to about less than 40,000, which was not nearly enough to siege Antioch, because Antioch was just too huge, and the citadel of the city was on a 1,000-foot tall mountain. And the walls had 6 gates that were well fortified, so the Crusaders decided to block 3 of the gates on the northwestern side in a semi-siege. This obviously didn't really work, and the Crusaders began to starve through the winter. So, but then in March of 1098, a fleet from Genoa managed to bring them reinforcement supplies. So on June 3rd, the Bohemond's Crusaders decided enough was enough. So they snuck around to one of the towers in the south, bribed a local garrison commander to let them through. Then they climbed up the wall and busted open the city gates, allowing the Crusaders to swarm into the city and capture it. And so they massacred a lot of civilians while they were in there. However, a lot of local Christians decided to join the Crusaders to fight off the Muslims, and the majority of the Muslim garrison that was left alive retreated up into the citadel where the Crusaders couldn't reach them. But ironically, after the Crusaders captured Antioch, the shoe was on the other foot, and they became besieged because a Turkish general named Kerboga led another army of about 35,000 strong all the way from Mosul to retake Antioch. And at this point, Alexios received reports that the Turks had wiped out the Crusaders, so he started to panic and pulled all of the Eastern Roman forces back to Constantinople to defend it, which left the Crusaders all by themselves, trapped in Antioch. So throughout the first 2 weeks of June, the Kerboga's Turks launched multiple non-stop attacks on the walls of Antioch, which the Crusaders fought like wild dogs to defend. And the Crusader morale increasingly dropped and desertion became rampant, which reduced their effective fighting numbers to less than 20,000. So they were now outnumbered by the Turks. But then, and just when it seemed things could not get any worse, a group of priests discovered what they believed to be the holy lance that had pierced Jesus' side on the cross, which shot Crusader morale through the roof, and suddenly they were totally fanatic and ready to die for God. And so, by the end of June, the heavily outnumbered Crusaders decided to march outside of the city walls and challenge the Turks into an open fight. And they charged directly into them and absolutely slaughtered the outnumbered Turkish forces. They charged the front line fell back in the second line, created chaos. The Crusaders had a field day, killing as many Turks as possible. They were absolutely fueled by their religious zealotry, I guess. So with Antioch finally secure, the Crusaders spent the next 5 months recovering after the crazy battle they had just fought. But a lot of the Crusaders had gotten fed up with the entire expedition at this point, so some of the leaders abandoned the crusade and returned to Europe. And to make things even worse, Bohemond broke his oath to Alexios and declared himself Prince of Antioch. He argued that Alexios had betrayed the Crusaders by not resupplying them. But the rest of the Crusaders, including Bohemond's nephew Tancred, decided, no, we've been doing this for, I think 3 years now, almost. I think this was about the third year point. They decided, no, we're not giving up now. We are going to push all the way to Jerusalem. We are going to win this war. And so by January 13th, 1099, the remaining Crusader forces marched out from Antioch towards Jerusalem without Bohemond. And they finally reached Jerusalem on June 7th, but they were really worse for wear at this point. There were now less than 12,000 knights and infantry. Not nearly enough to besiege Jerusalem because it was too big. And by this time, the Fatimid Caliphate from Egypt had pushed up and actually taken Jerusalem by force from the Turks. So Jerusalem now had a fresh garrison ready to fight. And even though they had beaten off the Turks, they now had a whole new enemy they had not faced before. So on June 12th, the Crusaders tried to attack one of the gates with a single siege ladder, but it was easily repulsed. But then, in a stroke of luck, a couple days later, another Genoese fleet arrived at the nearby port of Jaffa, where they dismantled their 6 ships and then carried all of the material all the way over to Jerusalem. And using these materials, the Crusaders managed to build 2 siege towers with some trebuchets and siege ladders in order to storm the walls again. And so, on July 8th, the Crusaders quite literally reenacted the Battle of Jericho and marched around the city walls and then pretty much held a church service on Calvary Hill where Jesus died. They truly believed at this point they were going to win and that God was giving them victory. And so the Crusaders launched their final attack on Jerusalem on July 15th, 1099. Count Raymond led a diversionary attack toward the south with one of the siege ladders. He attacked the Zion Gate, while the main force under Godfrey attacked a weakened section near the northern Damascus Gate with the second siege tower. Godfrey and Tancred personally led the first wave of Crusader infantry who stormed over the walls, and as illustrated in that picture, as soon as they push through. It was a mad melee of just kill, take this wall. And finally, the Crusaders managed to clear that section of the wall and just vicious hand-to-hand combat, and then threw open the gate, once again allowing the Crusaders to swarm into the city from that side. And from there, the Crusaders absolutely demolished the Fatimid garrison, killed as many as they could, and captured Jerusalem, completing the crusade. And it's said even in the Christian chronicles that the Crusaders massacred most of the civilian population in Jerusalem, but historians have now started to argue that is exaggerated, probably for a good story. It's said that I read one particular historian who estimated that they probably killed about 3,000 civilians in Jerusalem, which was actually pretty tame for that age. And so after they had captured Jerusalem, the Turks tried to take it back, but long story short, the Crusaders beat them back, and Jerusalem was firmly in Christian hands. And from there, the Crusaders created what they called the Crusader states of Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and the crown jewel, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So the Christian and Islamic worlds would fight for control of the Holy Land for the next 200 years, and it would end in about 1272 when the final crusade ended in Crusader defeat. But nearly 100 years before that, the Ayyubid Sultanate under Salah ibn Yusuf had conquered Jerusalem, which effectively ended Christian control of the Holy Land. And that's my bibliography.
Right. Thank you. Of Rome. Not to be confused with the spring of Rome.
Right. All right, cool. Yeah, that was. So to start, the Roman Empire. So it started with the Julio-Claudian dynasty. So Gaius Octavian Thurinus, who is Julius Caesar's nephew, became the first emperor of Rome. During his reign, Augustus, that he was also known as, reconstructed the laws of Rome and helped propose building projects. But following his death, the reign was then passed down to Tiberius. Tiberius did not only took the throne, but continued to enforce Augustus' policies. But as this dynasty just kept being passed on to the next person, which was Caligula. But he didn't have any experience in government, but was described as a wild-card emperor who restored treason trials and would even put multiple people to death. And then next in line was Claudius, who did bring back peace to Rome by restoring the laws, but was also as well a very quick-tempered emperor. And it was said that Claudius had around 30 senators and 400 people either executed or forced to kill themselves during his reign. Then the last of this dynasty was Nero, who was the last Roman emperor to reign in this dynasty. But he gained a reputation for unselfishness for his politics and from the Senate. But these were the first 5 rulers of the Roman Empire that actually started this trend. All right. So the death of Nero's suicide ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty, but it transitioned to the year of the 4 emperors, which consists of Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian. So Galba took the reign to start this year, but was soon assassinated. Following Galba's death, Otho took the throne, but at the same time as he was taking the throne, Vitellius was proclaiming himself as emperor, and for him to fully get that title, he went to Otho and defeated his army. And before they could reach Otho, he wrote a letter to his family and just committed suicide. And then as Vitellius was in his reign, many armies in Egypt, Judea, and Syria started saying that Vespasian should be the emperor. And as all of this was going on as well, someone resembled Nero and claimed to be Nero, which caused, I guess, Roman Empire drama. But even though that was still going on, Vitellius and Vespasian still wanted to battle between each other just to get to be the top dog. So Vespasian went to Rome to battle, taking out his forces in North Italy, and then his army went further and further into Rome, taking out Vitellius and his army as well, and Vespasian took the throne. But he was the foundation of the Flavian dynasty, and then it was passed down to his son Titus. And then during Titus' reign, he was the one that experienced the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. That buried Pompeii and Herculaneum. But later died due to an illness, which then made his brother Domitian the next ruler. So I can't really see the bottom of this. I had some other stuff, but it was pretty much, his brother was ruling for a bit. So yeah. Okay. So next was the 5 good emperors. And the emperors that were in this were, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. And these were the emperors that established justice in the Roman Empire. So Nerva started this trend, and was noticed for restoring the general laws and authorities, and even doing so, but even though he was doing his part, a lot of people felt that they wanted an emperor who had a more military background. So when Nerva did die, they did, put Trajan, in place, due to his, military background, and just because he was a powerful civil leader. So for his first military approach, he expanded the borders to their highest peace, and even built a good amount of public buildings. And for the civil standpoint, Trajan took the time to focus on bringing financial stability to the Roman Empire. But before he did die, he conquered a lot of land and territory that Hadrian had to then take care of for himself. But he was also known for his large projects and building walls as well. And then before he died, he did name Antonius Pius his successor before he died, making him the new emperor. And he was very skilled, a very skilled civil administrator, which gave him, they said that he was the most, out of these 5, he was the most peaceful emperor. And he focused on making the law more fair amongst everyone, and even made it easier for slaves to be freed. And then the last emperor of these 5 was Marcus Aurelius, who was the most philosophical ruler. During his reign, he took his focus on rebuilding the cities within the Rome. And Aurelius was very victorious in a lot of the battles that he had, and also wrote a book, The Meditations, that outlined to do what is right. So as Rome started to expand more and more, Diocletian felt led to split the empire into the west and east. But he made it known that he wanted to proclaim that the successors had to be chosen and improved, not like how it was before, it's just the next line coming in. So the 2 successors that were chosen were Maxentius and Constantine. But as soon as Diocletian died, there were civil war between the 2, like wanting to have both empires, which led to the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. So the 2 fought on the Milvian Bridge. Constantine did win the battle and became ruler. And it said that Maxentius drowned during the battle and was pulled out of the water to be decapitated and showcased in the streets of Rome. What better way to do it? So then Constantine. So in 312, Constantine took the throne. But he believes that the reason why he won this battle between Maxentius because of Jesus. It was said that on the evening of preparing for the battle, Constantine had a vision that God's protection was over him. And in this vision, he felt led to mark his soldiers' shields with the heavenly sign to protect not only like himself but his men as well. But because of him winning the battle, he did give him full control over the Western Empire, allowing for Christianity to be more dominant and make its way through this time period. So after Constantine died, his three sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans, divided the Roman Empire amongst themselves, leading to just more destruction and fighting between them. But it did get Constantine II, Constans, killed. And Constantius II eventually died, making Julian the next ruler. When Julian came into power, he removed Christians from government positions, banned the teaching of Christianity, but did eventually die as well, ending the Constantine dynasty. So then all of these responsibilities would soon pass down to Theodosius I, who initiated to convert pagan temples to Christian churches. He implemented the removal of religious belief that there are multiple gods on earth, to being it that there is only one true God. But because of Theodosius focusing so much on just the pagan beliefs, it kind of took away from a lot of other duties that he had to accomplish as a emperor. So then the Goths come into play. Between 376 and 382, Rome were in a lot of battles with the Goths. But arriving to the Roman Empire, the Goths wanted to settle there and become farmers, traders, and soldiers. But the Eastern Roman Empire Emperor Valens was not a fan of this, so he allowed the Visigoths to settle, but not the Ostrogoths, which led to a revolt from the Goths, which then started. So then 378 was the Battle of Adrianople. So the Goths brought their whole tribe to the Roman Empire, including their women, the Trojan, and the soldiers as well. But the Romans did manage to contain the Goths as much as they could, but other members of the Goths reached other parts of the Roman Empire. Emperor Valens tried to take full control over the situation, but was then taken out by the Goths as well as his men. So the fall. So doing research on just the fall itself from the Roman Empire, there was a lot of reasons why they felt like the fall came, and one of them was that the Roman Empire was so focused on building their Roman army that if they couldn't supply the Roman army what they needed, they couldn't supply for just their city as well. So as the Roman army started to weaken, the city itself started to weaken as well. And then also even following after the Battle of Adrianople, there was still plenty of Gothic wars, and so it just put the Roman Empire just on edge and having to constantly just be able to defend themselves every time somebody came to attack them. Some scholars argue that it was actually the increase of Christianity that pushed the Roman Empire to destruction. Yeah, I'm just putting up like whatever they said. Just because it took away from the traditional Roman system that affected just the military and the economy as well. And then in regards to the Roman government, some say that because the Roman Empire kept increasing in size, so it made it very difficult for whoever took the throne to govern, just because there's just so much they had to take care of. But yeah, and that was all.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, there you go.
All right.
Life of Charlemagne.
So we've talked a lot about Charlemagne. So it's a pretty brief PowerPoint, just with the words, because most of it we've gone over. But his early life, he was born in 1742, but due to a few things, they're not positive that was his actual birth year. They say that they found his parents essentially the equivalent of a marriage license that said 1744. So they're like, well, they wouldn't have a kid without being married, but I mean, weird things have happened. So his father was Pepin the Short, which was the son of Charles Martel. So he is the grandson of Charles Martel. His birth location is unknown. They think it's either somewhere in Germany or in Belgium. and he's considered illegitimate because his mother and Pepin were never married till after his birth. So, yeah. And then, obviously, as we learned, he was baptized at a young age because his mother was Catholic. So his rise to power, Pepin, so they believed in a vote to gain power. It was democratic, but it was like democratic with air quotes around it. So originally, Charles Martel had the power. He was the king, and Charles Martel gave his power to Pepin and Pepin's brother. I almost said cousin, but that's not right. But Pepin's cousin. And so from there, they had the power. Pepin and his brother shared the power. They were working equally to control the land or the kingdom. And Pepin's brother decided that he wanted to go and join a monastery. So he left. Obviously, he's not ruling. So the Pope came and intervened, and the Pope said, or the Pope's decision was that Pepin was now the king. He was no longer just the mayor, like one of the mayors of the land. He was the rightful king because his brother had given up his title. So Pepin's brother never wanted to give it up completely. He only wanted to give it up for a short portion of time until he was done being a monk, and then give it to his son. But the Pope said, no, you're not doing that. It's one way or the other. And that was after he already gave it up. So he was like, well, that kind of sucks. And thus Pepin gained all the power, and then Charles or Charlemagne, I wrote Charles because he's the great Charles. That's what he's referred to as well. Charles was given the power by Pepin, and this was a huge thing because Pepin had legitimate children who were like, what the heck, Dad? We're your legitimate children and you're giving it to him. But he didn't really care. And this third point was just describing how Pepin became from a mayor to becoming king. So the conquests. So once Charlemagne became king, Desiderius had taken some land up in the Lombardic kingdom that the Pope wanted back. So Charlemagne went and he retrieved the land for the Pope, and as Charlemagne was trying, they got him basically backed into a corner, and they're like, all right, you don't want to come out and fight us? That's all right. And they just laid siege to the city until the city fell. So then the Pope intervened at the end because the Pope was like, listen, you follow Catholicism. I'm the closest thing to God right now, so you're going to listen to me. And Charlemagne was like, okay. So the Pope basically said, okay, this is all your land now, but you're going to give them this small portion, and then you're going to give me part of your portion. And so Charlemagne was like, all right, this works. So one of his next conquests after that, Charlemagne went into North Italy, and the people fought back, obviously, because nobody likes being conquered. So during this time, it was a pretty steady progression of just the Charlemagne's army just moving in slowly and slowly until all of North Italy was theirs. And there was one duke that fought back with about 2 other dukes supporting him, and Charlemagne just destroyed them and was like, all right, or the army, not them. But Charlemagne destroyed the army and was like, all right, so you guys want to continue this? And the one that was in charge of the revolt was sentenced to death, while the other 2 were had to give oaths of loyalty, basically. And after this, Charlemagne tried to march into southern Italy and take all of it, but near, I think it was Milan is what they said, was where the southern Italians just stood strong. There were multiple invasions, but Charlemagne could never take over southern Italy, so he just kind of gave up on it. There wasn't really a reason for him to have it, besides he wanted it. As Emperor of Rome, he was in 1799 on Christmas Day, the Pope crowned him Emperor of Rome. There was a Latin term, but I don't remember Latin, nor am I good at speaking it, so I chose not to put it in here. The Carolingian king exercised the Banum. So the Carolingian king was Charlemagne, and the Banum is the right to rule. So it's like, okay, I have the right to rule, and as long as the people want me to rule, that's what's going to happen. So he went on a lot more conquests throughout. He tried going south into Africa a little bit, tried going farther east. There wasn't much to go west. But for basically everything, he relied on basic siege tactics because that was the easiest thing back then. And then he relied on horses, not just for war, but for travel. He created a basic monetary system, which I thought I put like a picture of it. It's like the little silver coin. I think it's like the Dias or something like that. Yeah. And then the funny part was he created the Jewish stereotype that we all know today of like Jews being like sticklers with money. He put like all the Jews in charge of the banking system. So I thought that was really funny that like he kind of created the Jewish stereotype. And then he was a big promoter of the arts. And that was really all I had, actually, because most of it we've gone over before.
All right. Thank you. All right, we have one more medieval, and then we have one other presentation. So, let's go Wilhelm the Conqueror.
William the Conqueror.
What's that?
I said William the Conqueror.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So I did William the Conqueror, and this is when he lived. And sorry. He was a great influence on England, and the Norman history is also a vital part of England, and the national heritage today was influenced greatly by one individual. It's this guy, and he was known by several names. They called him William the Bastard. They called him William the Conqueror, obviously, and William the Great, and William the Norman. And at age 7, he began his reign in Normandy, which is in France, obviously, as a duke. And Northmen changed, Normans, I put Northmen. They changed name to Normans, and he was considered the last Viking for some reason. William the Conqueror also became the King of England after winning the Battle of Hastings. In the Battle of Hastings, this is the Battle of Hastings, obviously. And in September 1066, William the Conqueror sailed from Normandy in a large fleet to fight the British on their own land. And it was a very fierce battle that changed the history of England forever. And Edward the Confessor, who was the Anglo-Saxon King of England, had died in January 106. And Edward did not have any children, so he had no heirs, so he had no offspring, so sad for him. And Harold Godwinson was named the successor and king, which was not a popular decision. October 14th, 1066, it was a very bloody battle, and Harold was defeated. And the death of the king was the beginning of a new dynasty and brought Normans into Britain. And William the Conqueror won because his army was more prepared and had better fighting tactics, and Godson was just, unlucky, unfortunate, sucks for him. So, and these are 10 facts about the Battle of Hastings. One of them is, despite its name, the Battle of Hastings actually took place about 6.5 miles northwest of Hastings, near the present-day town of Battle. And the first man recorded to be killed in the battle was William the Conqueror's jester, which would be their clowns or whatever back then. Taillefer. During the battle, both sides took a break for lunch, believe it or not. And this wasn't the first battle in which Harold was forced to defend his crown. And indeed, less than a month earlier, he had fought off his own brother, really, Tostig, and the Norwegian king Harold Hardrada. Hardrada?
Yeah.
Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. And it was really a one-sided battle. because most of the English army were on foot and supported by a few archers, while a quarter of the Norman army were on horses and were supported by many archers. So, and as for Harold, this is the facts. The battle was fought and won in literally a day, starting around 9 a.m. and closing at dusk. And although folklore at the Bayeux Tapestry that has it that Harold died after receiving an arrow to the eye, many historians believe he was in fact drubbed to death. And after William's victory, the French became the language of the king's court, and this, blended with Anglo-Saxon English, eventually evolved into the modern English language as we know today, and many French words are used in common parlance. Something like that, yeah. And 9, the Bayeux Tapestry is sometimes referred to in France as the Tapestry of Queen Matilda, and legend has it that William's wife, Queen Matilda, and her ladies in waiting made it, although in truth it's unlikely. And many genealogists believe that as much as 25% of the English population is descended from William the Conqueror himself, ever since he conquered England. Also in the reign in England. After his coronation, people supported him and followed him, and William tried to bring peace and settlement to England after he took over, and English remained the language instead of switching to French, shockingly. And William had many enemies and continued to fight battles, and that's not shocking either. And the death of William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror fought during his last battle, the Battle of Mance in France. And he was fighting the French in July 1087, and he was injured and ended up dying. And his quote of his legacy was, "Stranger and conqueror, his deed won him a right to a place on the roll of English statesmen, and no man that came after him has won a right to a higher place." So, those are my sources.
Thank you. Very good.